welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm really delighted to welcome Kimberly Zieselman here to the show today. Kimberly is an intersex woman lawyer and a human rights advocate with more than 25 years of experience in nonprofit leadership and advocacy. She served as executive director of Interact, Advocates for Intersex Youth, the premier intersex policy organization in the United States. In 2022, the State Department appointed her senior advisor to the Special Envoy for LGBTQI Human Rights. In 2020, Kimberly published XOXY, a memoir. It's an award-winning memoir sharing her personal and professional intersex journey. So, Kimberly, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you know, I had the pleasure of hearing a workshop you did for the Cary Library in Lexington in January. And I have to tell you that I learned so much about what I didn't know that I just couldn't resist inviting you to come on the show and let everybody know the things they don't know that they don't know about what it means to be intersex.
Right.
So thank you for that. And to start us off then, following that, please define intersex for us.
Of course. Many people still don't know what intersex means. Intersex describes a person born with one or more variations of sex anatomy, or what we commonly call sex characteristics, that don't align with what is typically thought of as either a male or a female body. So, for example, things like genitals or internal reproductive organs, chromosomes or hormones, or any combination thereof. It affects nearly 2% of the population. So that means it's as common as red hair or green eyes, and even more common than identical twins. But it's not really known. It seemed to be so much more rare because it's been so invisible.
Yeah.
But in fact, about 1 in 2,000 babies are born with visible variations of sex anatomy upon birth. But intersex traits can also be discovered later on in life, which was my own personal situation, at puberty or later in adulthood.
Yeah. 2% is a lot of people. And so let's factor in that is whether or not it's well known or whether or not people understand what it means, it affects the lives of a tremendous number of human beings. So it's good for us all to understand more about what it does mean. And along those lines, then, Kimberly, what are some of the most common misunderstandings about what it means to be a person who's intersex?
First, I have to say a misunderstanding is that we need to be fixed, right? Because we are somehow disordered, because our bodies don't fit, right? Common notions of what a binary male or female body should be. We know now that sex is variable, as many things are in nature. Second, I think, is that intersex people have both male and female reproductive organs or genitalia, and that we are all hermaphrodites. Many people have only heard about intersex through the very popular novel from a few years back, Middlesex, which was written, of course, by a non-intersex person and without any real consultation with the community. In fact, true hermaphrodites are mythological beings, but intersex people are real. So that's a common misunderstanding. And I think the third most common one is that all intersex people's genders are fluid, either fluid or non-binary, not male, not female, but something in between. But the truth is, while some intersex people may have a non-binary or gender fluid identity, the vast majority identify as either male or female.
Yeah.
Intersex people can have, any gender identity or sexual orientation, for that matter, as the rest of the population. We are really a diverse and complex community, just like everyone else.
Yeah, and important to establish that. And I was hoping that you might share with us your own story, Kimberly, because it's very powerful and very informative. Could you tell us how you found out about being intersex and why it took you until the age of 41 to learn the full truth?
Sure. So I was diagnosed and actually operated on at the age of 15, but I was lied to about why I was having this surgery and what was actually discovered about my own body. So I was told that I had partially formed, typically female reproductive organs that needed to be removed quickly to prevent them from becoming cancerous. And a couple of months later, I was, in surgery, um, having what I called for 25 years later, a hysterectomy, which was not at all a
Mhm.
hysterectomy. At 41, I ended up getting my medical records after experiencing some unrelated medical issues that triggered some kind of post-traumatic stress and anxiety from my past, from this past surgery that led me to investigate what had really happened to me as a child. Um, I discovered that the truth was I had been diagnosed as having androgen insensitivity syndrome, and in fact have XY chromosomes instead of XX. XY typically considered to be male, and
Mhm.
XX typically considered to be female, of course. And that I had in fact been born with internal testes instead of ovaries, and no uterus or no fallopian tubes or no cervix. So clearly what I had was not a hysterectomy. Um, Also, I discovered there was a post-operative report, pathology report that described my internal testes, the tissue that was removed, as being perfectly healthy. So
Yeah.
in fact, they were not cancerous. And, at the age of 41, this was all new information about my body and what had been done to me
Yeah.
at age 15.
Yeah. It's a shocking story, Kimberly, because of the arrogance of the medical system.
Mhm,
And they lied to you, they lied to your parents about what
mhm.
was going on, and they had told you that they were concerned that you might get cancer. So that's in your mind then,
That was in
over
my
the
mind
course
for
of your life.
years. Yeah,
And then you wound up having to have basically hormone replacement therapy
that's right.
for the
That's
rest of
right.
your life. And
That's right.
so this fits in with the next thing I wanted to ask you about, because I think it's important that people understand the consequence of that kind
Mhm,
of medical arrogance and the
mhm,
pathologizing
mhm.
of being intersex. So tell us about how you now view the harms that you experienced emotionally and in terms of your health from the surgery that you received without any informed consent from you
Right,
or from your parents.
right. So before I answer that, I also just want to point out that my story is not that unique. It may be
Mm.
shocking, but I think it's important for people to understand who are watching this that I have met hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of
Yeah.
people who have very similar stories to mine, some of them almost identical.
Mhm.
This is something that, particularly in our generation, less so as the younger generation is being operated on, has been very quiet about for years. And so although I may be one of the people speaking out, I'm speaking out for a large number
Yeah.
of people. So I think there have been both emotional and physical harms. I think the emotional harms were the greatest in my case, quite
Mhm.
honestly, and I think in many cases. Um, I often refer to this as the invisible harm.
Mm.
It turns out that the secrets and lies were more harmful
Mm.
than the truth would have been.
Yeah.
There was a lot of secrecy and awkwardness around my diagnosis, around my surgery, and adolescence that created like unnecessary stigma and shame around my body, and in many ways, my identity as a female.
Yeah.
Um, in my case, I always identified as female, but it was something very uncomfortable. When my friends got their periods, I knew, as after 15 and after my surgery, I realized that was never going to happen to me. Um, when changing in the locker room, even I was into sports as a child, and even before my surgery, but certainly after when I had scars as well, I was very self-conscious about, the physical characteristics. One of them being a lack, with my particular intersex trait, being a lack of body hair.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
so even though by today's norms, that might be seen as something, typical or normal, back in the 80s, it wasn't. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so it was something that made me very self-conscious and feel
Yeah.
very different and not like all the other girls or all the other young women.
Mhm.
Um, when my friends and family started having babies, even the adoption of my own amazing twin
Mhm.
daughters, I often struggled somewhat silently with the question of whether or not I was a real mother
Yeah.
slash, real woman,
Yeah.
and what that meant. Um, and even though I was told lies about my body and how I was born like all other women, typically, just with some differences, deep down, I always felt like it was more than that. Like I
Yeah.
always had this sense that there was something more I wasn't being told, but I was also really afraid to ask or face. And so that sense of shame and fear, I think, just forced me to bury my deep feelings, which ultimately contributed to frequently dissociating in my young,
Mhm.
particularly in my young adult life, which I talk about a lot in the book,
Yeah.
until I learned the truth and was able to get help. So I think those emotional harms for me were the invisible harms, and I call them invisible because on paper, or if you knew me in passing, you would never know,
Yeah.
right? Um, the physical harms were a little less invisible, but it was primarily robbing me of my natural hormone production because they took out my healthy testes that, I now understand could have been kept inside and monitored annually, probably right up until, you know, typical menopausal age.
Mhm.
And that, could have benefited me greatly and
Yeah.
prevented the hormone replacement therapy, which is never as good as the real thing, which has side effects, which has
Yeah.
risks, by the way, which many are not studied or fully known because there have not been studies on the long-term effects of hormone replacement therapy on women, frankly, but particularly intersex women. So, or intersex people. So, yeah, those were the physical harms. I think the emotion. I think it's interesting to note too the emotional harm
Mhm.
also impacts physical being by creating, I believe, more stress.
Yeah.
And in my case, and in the cases of so many people I meet, intersex people, a common theme is distrust of doctors and a fear of medical care and a fear of seeing doctors, and not, whether it's because you're afraid you've had trauma in the past, or if, there's trust issues, or it's just not something that you're comfortable with. People don't tend to not seek out even
Yeah.
preventative care or even treatment when they, have
Yeah.
something that needs to be treated.
Yeah. And that's just another layer of harm to the other ones,
Right.
because it can interfere then with getting preventive care or just feeling trust
That's
for
right.
your medical providers. And what you did that I think is so impressive, Kimberly, is you translated a lot of what you just described into life as a very effective and eloquent advocate. You were executive director of Interact prior to your current role for the State Department. And Interact's mission is to end harmful medical interventions on intersex children, with some of those interventions happening when children are infants.
Yes.
So help us to understand what some of these surgical interventions have been in the past and still are, I believe.
Yeah, in many cases still are. So the most common medically unnecessary interventions are actually performed before a person is 2 years old. So the vast majority, this was not my story,
Yeah,
the vast majority of cases, they are happening to infants well before an intersex person has the potential to understand or voice,
yeah,
and of course, about their own body. So for example, surgically altering the size and shape of an infant's phallus, which is usually considered a clitoris,
mhm,
those cases, and that, by the way, requires things like binding the baby's legs together for weeks during the
mhm,
healing process, or creating a vagina in a toddler, which,
mm,
by the way, requires regular vaginal dilation as they grow up, um, done at home, usually by a parent. So you can imagine the psychological
yeah,
implications. Um, Fortunately, that is done much less frequently
mm,
now on infants. But the clitoral reductions and surgeries are still very, very common, and
mhm,
there's a huge debate around
mhm.
that in the medical community right now. Another very common surgery is to relocate the hole where a presumed male child urinates from perhaps the side of the penis to the tip of the penis. And this isn't so that they can urinate, it's so that they can urinate, it's so that they can pee standing up. So it's done for a very social kind of reason, with the thinking of, well, this child should not be embarrassed about having to sit down to pee. They should be able to stand up at the urinal. Unfortunately, the reality is those surgeries require multiple surgeries over a person's life as they grow, and they can be quite painful. And it's not always the right situation. If it's something that someone chooses to do later on and they're making an informed decision, that's a very different thing, I think. So none of those examples that I just gave you are medically necessary, just to be clear. Like these are done purely for social or cosmetic reasons, most often to ease the anxiety of parents who worry about their children living a quote normal life.
Yeah, it seems like they're done in anticipation of shame and embarrassment.
That's right.
But they make you cringe to hear about it. Or just make you, I mean, literally to hear about these intense and invasive surgeries being done on such young children. They just make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. So, well, and you've talked about, well, I wonder if there's more you want to say about the fears and the assumptions or the conventions that lead doctors and parents to believe they're doing the right thing for their child.
That's right. And I do believe that most, if not all, parents and doctors are well-meaning, trying to do what they think is the best, for their child. But they are bringing all their own fears and assumptions and beliefs, right, to their decision making. First is the belief that I think we have all been taught, that sex is always binary, right? That there's really nothing in between, and that if there is, it's an abnormality, it's unnatural or wrong. I think second is the fear that a child, as you alluded to, will suffer in the future emotionally from other people's reactions to their body being different, right? I also think some parents and doctors are motivated by their own internalized, perhaps, or blatant, but I think most usually internalized homophobia. And the fear that if a child doesn't have, a binary looking, typical looking, whatever you want to call it, body, that they will identify with what is, what they consider not to be mainstream or normal. Even though being intersex is not a sexual orientation or even a gender identity for most people, there is an association with, whenever we're talking about sex characteristics and genitals and bodies, immediately the thinking goes to sexual activity and sexual orientation. So I do think a bit of homophobia on behalf of parents and doctors do drive these surgeries. It's just, it's fear. It's another form of a fear of difference, right? When I was operated on, my doctors removed, my only surgery was to remove my internal testes. But while I was under, they examined me and discovered that my vagina was apparently much shorter than a typical female's. And so after surgery and consultation, they recommended having a vaginoplasty, forming a longer vagina, which is quite an intense and invasive surgery. And their reasoning was so that I would be able to have sex with my husband someday. And I think that's just and I've heard this, I have heard this story from many others. And that's a common form of, perhaps it's not homophobia, but that's the kind of misogyny and the kind of typical, often these doctors are men, and it's kind of this typical assumption that everyone's going to want to have heterosexual sex in a traditional way with a member of the opposite sex. That ended up to be the case in my situation, but certainly not everyone's. And so I think these are the types of biases and notions that doctors and parents, of course, bring to the table, which I understand. We all bring our own experiences and beliefs to the table in decision making. Unfortunately, I escaped that unnecessary surgery, but I understand I've talked to women who didn't, intersex people who have similar intersex traits as myself, who suffered from that surgery and have continued to
Yeah.
suffer. So I feel a little bit of survivor's guilt around that one. I was one of the lucky ones. Um, and I think the last thing I want to say on this is that about doctors, it's it's a very small subset of medical professionals, primarily pediatric urologists, who are the surgeons with a vested interest in performing these various surgeries on infants and children. Um, it it's what they're trained for. It's their chosen specialty and profession, and as that, they are motivated to try and fix perceived problems with surgical intervention. They often have significant egos and are able to compartmentalize their thinking. I mean, I'm generalizing here, but this is based on observations I've made over several years
Yeah.
doing this advocacy work. And I think we also can't ignore that the medical institutions, which are often children's hospitals, benefit financially from providing these
Yeah.
surgeries. Having worked in a children's hospital myself for years, despite their awesome mission, at the core, they are still a business, and our healthcare system sadly dictates that. So I think that's another piece that's driving, there's the parental decision making and the lack of information and support for parents, as well as kind of the medical industrial
Complex.
complex, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that very illuminating kind of discussion about those factors, and it's complicated. There's a
Mhm.
lot of different factors
It-
involved in it, but happily, part of the work that you've done as an advocate is to help change things. You've educated people and institutions about what it means to be intersex, as you're doing for us right now, and as you do that, it shines a light that helps people expand their understanding and their imaginations. And when you shine the light, you get rid of things that are hidden away, and it makes them discussable.
mhm.
And it reduces the amount of shame that's involved,
That's right.
which is so important. And I wanted to ask you, Kimberly, because you've been doing this advocacy work for some time now, what are the shifts that you've seen that you're happiest about? And what are some of the remaining goals that you think, no, we got to get around to that next?
So first, I want to note that there were many brave pioneer
Mm,
intersex advocates who came before me,
sure.
going back into the early '90s when I was, still in my early 20s and clueless about my own intersex status. So, I have been able to benefit on their backs of being brave and speaking out before me. And also now I am not the only one speaking out. Thankfully, there are
Mhm.
many other brave individuals sharing their stories and speaking out, which I think is essential. I mean, that what I've seen in the last 15 years or so is a growing awareness with a long way to go, but the growing awareness is largely due to an increasing number of intersex people and intersex voices speaking out.
Yeah.
And most of these voices still today are young people, unlike myself, in their teens and 20s, sharing their stories that happened to them in the more recent past.
Mhm.
Um, Clearly the internet and the rise of social media um, has been a vehicle for both community connection, which I think is essential to being empowered to speak out, and also a vehicle for content sharing and education. So I think the internet has played a major role, just like it has in the intersex movement, just like it has for many other
Yeah.
movements. There are good and bad things to say about that, but I think the good has outweighed the bad as far as awareness raising and connection, which is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things that you said during your Cary Library talk that really stayed with me was some advice you had for parents of children who are born as intersex beings. And you encouraged them to view this not as an emergency, but as a complexity, a single word that shifts the frame entirely, because
Mm,
we respond to complexities often with interest and engagement, whereas something that's an emergency is something that scares us, and often our judgment goes out the window
that's right.
because we're reacting from stress. So I wonder if there are other words that you may have for parents that might help them understand and act upon perhaps a broader imagination about what is right, in quote marks, for their child.
Right. I think for most parents, it does just come down to a lack of information and understanding combined with an understandable fear and stress, which is also combined with the unbalanced power dynamic, right, that exists between themselves during a vulnerable time vis-a-vis a doctor, for example. Um, I think if parents could come to the situation with some even general understanding of what intersex is, or even just that it's an option, such as hearing about it in the media or knowing another family member or friends have talked openly about it, I think that will really start to help change things.
Yeah.
There should be a chapter in that book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, for example,
Yes, what a
that
great
talks
idea.
about, up in 2% of the cases, this may happen, and this is what it means, and here was where you go for more resources. I mean, um, I think the best thing for parents, similar to intersex individuals, I might add, is peer support
Mm,
and information that comes from other parents who are going through it at the same time, or even better yet, have been there, done that, who have experienced the same things and even learned from their mistakes. There are, support groups for parents, and I've seen the value up close and
yeah.
seen the impact. I've seen a shift to more and more parents who are getting information early on and
Mhm.
feeling less stressed, and and meeting other intersex adults and hearing the stories like mine and getting a broader understanding of what is involved, and then enabling them to help make better decisions with their children
Yeah.
as they get older. And
Yeah.
I think that's the goal. It also requires doctors to be more informed. I mean, a lot of people are surprised to hear that many doctors don't know about this. Um, unless you're a specialist, or go on into some subspecialty that more directly relates to this, you maybe have had, like, a paragraph in a medical textbook
Yeah.
during med school. So changes in medical school curriculum, which are starting to happen for LGBT more broadly, I think also have to happen in understanding intersex,
Mm,
at all
yeah.
stages of the life cycle.
Yeah, knowledge is power and freedom and compassion as well.
Right.
So thank you for that, Kimberly. Well, we're running out of our time, but I can't let you go without finding out, what does a special envoy do? Um, because I didn't know. I mean, I'd heard special envoy, but I didn't know there was one for LGBTQI plus.
It's
So, and you're the senior advisor to the special envoy. So this is international work, I take it.
It is international work. So currently, the US is just one of 5 countries that has a special envoy for
Mm,
LGBTQI human rights. Um, as in other countries, our special envoy's role is to champion the advancement of human rights for gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, and intersex people around the world. Um, the office works closely and collaboratively with community
mhm.
advocates on the ground and government officials
Yeah.
in these various countries to encourage and support things like decriminalization of same-sex relations.
Mm,
Countries, it's still
yeah.
criminal. Um, Marriage equality,
Yeah.
um, non-discrimination protections, whether it's housing or workplace protections or in healthcare, legal gender recognition measures, and the end to harmful practices such as so-called gay conversion therapy,
Mhm.
um, and intersex genital mutilation, which is often what it's referred to in the international advocacy
Mm,
realm. Um, so in my role, I support the special envoy and her team broadly. I am one of a few special advisors that she has.
mhm.
Um, I bring my particular intersex expertise to the table, and I think and I know it's very pioneering of her and of the U.S. government to have um, to be shining a light on the intersex issues right
Yeah.
now. It is unique.
Yeah.
It's not happening most places. That's not to say that we instantly have laws and policies here in the US that are protecting
Mhm.
intersex people. We still have a long way to go, but under the current administration, there are steps being taken
Mhm.
towards that, which give me hope.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm glad to hear about the work you're doing internationally. It sounds fascinating and truly important. Um, Closer to home, though, Kimberly, what resources do you want to recommend for people who are interested in learning more about the experience of being intersex? And I will say that, a good starting place is your
Sure.
really well written, very engaging book, XOXY. But are there other resources that you would like to suggest to people? And please do tell people about your own website, about yourself and your background in
Sure.
your book.
Sure. So, a great organization for information on intersex and intersex advocacy, and laws and policy, and how you can help would be Interact advocates.org. So it's Interact Advocates, all one word, .org. They also Interact also has another website that's very helpful and more targeted to getting basic information if you want to become an ally and get more involved. And that's the number 4, intersex.org.
Okay.
My book is XOXYKZ, my initials, .com. And I also have a kimberly.zieselman.com website. And of course, I recommend folks going to their local bookstores or libraries and getting the book if you're interested in doing that. I am happy to say I know of at least 2 other intersex memoirs that are coming out next year
Oh,
by friends of mine in the movement who are younger than I. There again, this next generation is really where the change is going to be coming from over the next decade or two. Um, so stay tuned for more diverse intersex stories in books. I'm also working on some TV and film projects, sort of my own personal passion of trying to bring more authentic narratives to mainstream media and entertainment media, because I think it's really going to take that to truly
yeah,
change hearts and minds in a meaningful way down the
yeah.
road. So I think there will be more stories and more awareness raising in the next few years to come.
And that will be very welcome indeed. And Kimberly, thank you so much for all the work that you've done. And thank you for taking time to visit the morning show today and to educate us and fill in the blanks and shine light upon a subject that needs to be better understood. I really appreciate your taking time to do this, and I really appreciated your book. I would add that in addition to learning a lot about what it means to be an intersex person, your book also it helps people understand how to become an advocate, how to become an activist, especially if you don't start out life um, knowing how. And it's an incredible journey that you describe, and you clearly have emerged as a very powerful voice. So thank you for all the activism that you've done, and thank you for your time, Kimberly. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thanks so much for having me.
It's been my pleasure. Join us again next week at Thursday at 9 for the morning show, everybody. Till then, take care, be well.